The MLB hot stove is already starting to heat up right here around Thanksgiving. So for the first time this offseason, we open up the Locked On Orioles mailbag, answering your O's questions. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, November 29th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are diving into the mailbag for the first time this offseason, answering 9 Orioles questions coming all from you, the listeners. We'll talk a bit about the Blake Snell signing and how that impacts the Orioles this offseason, as he has signed a big deal with the Dodgers. We'll talk about Corbin Burnes and his possibility to come back to Baltimore, Felix Bautista updates, what Trevor Rogers could do for the O's next year, and so much more. Coming up on this mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So we're opening up the mailbag today. We'll let you know that I am recording this here on Wednesday, although you are hearing it or seeing it on Friday after Thanksgiving. Just wanted a long weekend for myself. Hope you were fine with no episode on Thanksgiving. Hope, however, you celebrated the week, that you did enjoy yourself and get the time that you needed. But we are right back here on the Locked On Orioles podcast. Make sure that you are liking, commenting, and subscribing to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen. If you can leave a 5-star rating and a review, whether you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really, really helps out the show as well. And if you had a mailbag question that you sent in that didn't get answered, that's okay. It'll be answered on a future mailbag episode. If you want to send in future mailbag questions, you can leave them right here in the YouTube comment section, or you can email me at lockedonorioles@gmail.com. So let's jump into our first mailbag question of the day. This one comes from Daryl via email, who asks, who do you think the Orioles could be targeting to add to the bullpen? Now, this is something I talked about earlier this week on the show, with the Orioles declining the option on Danny Coulomb and then deciding to non-tender Jacob Webb. Those are two of the Orioles' more important middle relievers over the past year plus that are now gone, and the Orioles certainly have other internal options. But I figure that the Orioles will add one relief pitcher in free agency this offseason. Now, who knows where it's going to come from? And later in the coming weeks, I'm going to do some free agent wish list episodes talking about left-handed and right-handed relievers that are out there that I think the Orioles could go after. So stay tuned for that. But I'll basically use this to do a little preview of that. I'll give you 2 righties and 2 lefties who are free agent relievers who I think the O's could at least be intrigued by. Tommy Kahnle is one of the righties. We saw him throw 60-some consecutive changeups in the postseason as kind of one of the setup men for the New York Yankees. He's a little older, but he has one elite pitch. He can throw other stuff around it. He has had a lot of health issues, but he seems to be healthy now and shouldn't be a huge concern to cost you a lot of money. I think he'd be a nice veteran addition. Lucas Sims is another lower floor, higher ceiling guy I think the O's could go after. Right-hander who spent last year between the Reds and then was traded to the Red Sox near the end of the year. Doesn't have the greatest numbers, but has this insane spin on his fastball, and his breaking balls has incredible stuff. I think the Orioles could be a team to maybe hone him in and turn him into a good middle reliever. On the left side, I like another Yankee. I like Tim Hill. Yankees kind of brought him in mid-season, fixed him a bit. He's got that funky lefty delivery, gets every ground ball in the world. It's not the most electric stuff, but it's just, I think the O's need a funky left-hander in that bullpen. I think Tim Hill would be a nice addition. And then the last one is AJ Minter. Like a couple of years ago, he was one of the best left-handed relievers in baseball, part of that dominant Braves bullpen, but he's had a couple of injuries since then. He this year was out for most of the season with hip surgery, but it seems like he'll bounce back and be okay for 2025. That could be a big-time buy low guy for the Orioles, and if he can get back to the old AJ Minter, that would be a huge addition to that bullpen. Second question comes from David via email, who asks, did Corbin Burnes stop throwing to Adley Rutschman down the stretch? Meaning, was it purposeful that Adley Rutschman wasn't catching Burnes as much, and instead James McCann was doing the job near the end of the season? I know that is somewhat of a narrative that is out there, that Corbin Burnes' personal catcher is James McCann. He doesn't like throwing to Adley Rutschman. And the question was, how will that impact his free agency with McCann also being a free agent and Burnes knowing if he comes back, he's going to be caught by Rutschman. Does he like that? All that stuff. I just wanted to dive into the numbers and set the record straight on what actually happened this year in terms of who was catching Corbin Burnes. So Burnes made 33 starts this year, 32 in the regular season and 1 in the postseason. Rutschman caught 17 of them, and McCann caught 16 of them. So a slight edge to the starting catcher, but mostly down the middle. Now, that is important to know because, yes, Rutschman did catch Burnes more than McCann, but Rutschman in general is catching almost, maybe not 2/3 of the games, but more than half of the games across the board. Of the 162 games this year, Adley Rutschman caught 99 games as the starting catcher. James McCann caught 63. So that percentage is a little bit wider than 17 to 16 off across the board. So generally, Adley Rutschman did catch Corbin Burnes at a lower rate than he caught most of the other Orioles regular starting pitchers this season. So that is certainly something to note. And James McCann did catch Corbin Burnes' final 4 starts of the year. He caught his final 3 regular season starts. And remember, McCann was in the lineup as the catcher in wildcard game 1 when Burnes was pitching against the Royals. So his final 4 starts, McCann was behind the plate. And I think that is what made this question come up because it was like, yeah, okay, Corbin Burnes can like James McCann, but you're not going to start James McCann in a postseason game, are you? And then the Orioles did that in game 1 to catch Corbin Burnes. Now, a little bit of it was because the O's offense was struggling so much, and the Royals did have a lefty and Cole Reagans out there on the mound and getting the righty James McCann in there, and he had been hitting pretty well down the stretch, but still, it was a decision that made you question some things there. Now, there's not really, though, an indication that he started working with Burnes more as the season went on. I mean, the Orioles just caught Adley Rutschman a little bit less later in the season because the bat was struggling so much. They were trying to get him off his feet just a little bit more and DH him a little bit more. But McCann caught the final 4 starts of Burnes, but the previous 2 before that in September and August were caught by Adley Rutschman. So it's not like there was some giant streak where literally McCann was the personal catcher. Like we've seen that before across Major League Baseball, where a starter likes the backup catcher better. And every time he starts, it's the backup that's in there. No matter the matchup, the other starting pitcher, the time of day it is, whatever it is, that backup is in there for that starting pitcher. And that was not the case. Again, it was more of an even split. And yeah, there was 4 in a row at the end of the year, but that's not long enough to make it look like a serious pattern. And some of this that, yeah, McCann is catching Burnes at a higher percentage than he is the other pitchers. Some of it is just when Burnes' starts would fall in. I mean, sometimes they would come on a day game after a night game. That is always when your backup catcher is going to catch. You don't want your starting catcher going 9 innings at 7 o'clock and then 9 innings at 1 o'clock the next day. Or sometimes when there was a left-handed pitcher on the other side, Brandon Hyde was more likely to kind of pigeonhole James McCann into the lineup on those days when McCann could hit lefties better and he could still DH Adley Rutschman, who hit lefties incredibly well while giving him the day off to catch and allowing James McCann back there. So sometimes that would fall in on Burnes' start as well, which is certainly part of this. But again, it's not uncommon for a pitcher to prefer one catcher over another. Now, some take it to the extreme of, I have my personal catcher. This is the only guy who catches me. I do not think that was the case with Burnes and McCann, but I think it's reasonable to say he preferred James McCann behind the plate for him over Adley Rutschman. I don't think that means he was like, yeah, Adley's not catching me. I just think every pitcher has 2 catchers on the roster with him, and I guarantee you every single pitcher probably prefers one of the catchers to the other. Even if it's just slightly, everybody has their preferences in that sense. And listen, McCann was swinging the bat better than Adley Rutschman was down the stretch this year. I don't imagine that happening really ever again. That was just a really bad slump for Adley. And so it was okay that McCann was in the lineup a little bit more. And I think some of it too was just Burnes' inability to control the running game. I think Adley's one weakness as a defensive catcher is his throwing and his ability to control the running game. That is the one part defensively where James McCann is better than Adley Rutschman. Neither of them are elite at it at all, but McCann is better. And so if Burnes did prefer McCann a little bit anyway, and he controls the running game better, and we know nobody had more bases stolen on them than Corbin Burnes this year, and we saw it become a problem multiple times, that probably went into that thinking as well. But I would not worry about this carrying over at all, impacting Corbin Burnes, impacting where he will sign. If the Orioles are paying him a good amount of money and a competitive offer, he will sign here and will certainly be fine with Adley Rutschman catching him for the next 7 years if the O's give him that deal to come here to Baltimore. But again, wouldn't be surprised if he did somewhat prefer James McCann back there to Adley Rutschman. Next question of the day. This one, didn't write down who asked this question. I do apologize. Let me know whoever did. But when do you think the Orioles will make their first big offseason signing? This is a good question. I think a lot of people get a little frustrated with the slowness of the MLB offseason. Now, we've had some deals this week, certainly, and we will get to those in a little bit. But generally, not much gets done until the winter meetings begin. The winter meetings are a little later this year. They're December 9th through 12th in Dallas, so we got a couple more weeks to wait until those things kick off. So my prediction will be the Orioles add a player at the winter meetings. I don't know if that's going to be their big splash or they just make their kind of first real free agent signing there. It could be either way. But if they're getting Corbin Burnes, like maybe he'll wait a little longer. Maybe he'll wait till January. He'll feel out the offers, all that good stuff, see if other teams want to jump in. But here's the thing, like there was a large free agent signing, a top 5 player on the free agent market signed before Thanksgiving. That's not something that usually happens. And we're going to talk about that coming up next with Blake Snell signing with the Dodgers. Were the Orioles really in on Snell this offseason? Plus, a question about Felix Bautista and Trevor Rogers. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, we're in the offseason, not a lot of baseball tickets being bought, but if you want to go see basketball, football, hockey, whatever it may be, Game Time is the place for you. But you might just be, I'm a baseball fan, it's no sports in the offseason. I totally get that. Well, with Game Time Picks, curation makes it easier to save more on sports tickets, but also concerts, comedy, theater, and more. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So we continue on with this Locked On Orioles mailbag, the first mailbag of the offseason. We get to question number 4 on the day, sent in by Eliza via email, who asks, do you think the Orioles were really in on Blake Snell? This is more of a late-breaking question for the mailbag because on Tuesday, Blake Snell signed with the Los Angeles Dodgers, a 5-year, $182 million deal for Snell to go to LA. And Blake Snell, without a doubt, was a top 5 free agent on the market this year. I would call him the number 2 starting pitcher behind Corbin Burnes, who was available in free agency. And when I did my left-handed starting pitcher free agent wish list last week, I put Blake Snell as number 1. I said he's a true ace. For a good stretch of the last 2 seasons, he has been, without a doubt, the best pitcher in Major League Baseball. He won the Cy Young in 2023. When he came back from injury this year, he was the best pitcher in the second half of the season in baseball. He is a guy who can change your team. And the Orioles were reportedly in on him. Ken Rosenthal had reported that the O's were interested. And after Snell signed this contract, it's reported about $60 million of that is deferred money. Of course it is. The free agent matrix by John Becker, the average prediction was 4 years, $124 million. He gets the extra year and $182 million. But Mark Feinsand of MLB.com reported after Snell signed on Tuesday that the other teams that were in on Snell were the Yankees, the Red Sox, and the Orioles. And I do just want to take a moment to step back and look at this big picture. There were apparently 4 teams in on signing Blake Snell at the end. They were the Dodgers, duh. The Yankees, duh. The Red Sox, even though the last couple of years they've been doing weird stuff financially. The Red Sox, duh. Think about what this means. And again, I'm not trying to be like, oh, they tried the we tried list. No, we were so close to this free agent. Like at some point you got to sign guys. I get it. But where we went from John Angelos to just this first offseason now with David Rubenstein, the Orioles are the 4th team listed in on one of the best free agents out there for big money, along with the Yankees, Red Sox, and Dodgers. That is not something we could have ever predicted just a year ago at this point when this team was just as good and should have been buying at the top of the free agent market. So even that tells me that the Orioles were making a competitive offer that competed with 5 years, $182 million that Snell got from the Dodgers. And it's possible that the Orioles weren't willing to go past 3 or 4 years for Snell. Maybe they were giving him more money per year, but were worried about giving 5+ years to a guy who can, has some injury concerns in his history and can be a little inconsistent despite how good he's been the past 2 seasons. And I totally get that from the Orioles' perspective. I still would have loved to have had Blake Snell. Instead, he is signing with the Dodgers. But I think what this is continuing to tell us is that the Orioles are truly playing at the top of the starting pitching market, both in trades and now in free agency as well, as they try to improve that starting rotation. Now, if you want a guy that can be a true ace, I thought there were 3 coming into the offseason. Thought it was Blake Snell, Corbin Burnes, and Max Fried. Now, with Snell off the board, there are only 2 remaining. Now, I will say, I think it was pretty much a given, maybe not a given, but I think most people assumed the Dodgers were going to sign one of those 3 guys. And I think we're all assuming that the Dodgers are also going to get Roki Sasaki coming over from Japan. So if the Dodgers are getting Snell and Sasaki, they might get another pitcher that's further down the market. But in terms of the guys who could be aces, they're probably not also going to get Burnes or Fried. And Burnes and Fried are both California natives, both guys who I would think have expressed interest in pitching for the Dodgers. Those were the 2 guys who I actually thought more likely than Snell could be the Dodgers' selection as their number 1 ace. And I thought the number 1 competitors for the Orioles getting either of those 2 pitchers. So maybe those 2 come back to the market now with the Dodgers saying, hey, we're getting Snell. We're going to go after Sasaki. That's going to be our pitching additions. Maybe it makes it more likely for either Burnes or Fried to come to Baltimore. And honestly, with everything I continue to see, I continue to update my Corbin Burnes confidence meter, how likely I think it is that he will sign with the Orioles. During the season, it was 5%. A couple of weeks ago, it went to 10%. I am bumping the Corbin Burnes meter up to 15%. Me putting the likelihood of him signing with the Orioles. Trying not to get too optimistic, but signs are pointing to the O's are at least playing at the top of the free agent pool. Question number 5 comes from Rob via YouTube, who asks, can you give us an update on Felix Bautista? Now, I don't have any further reporting that's been done than anyone else, but I can certainly give you a further update. As we know, Felix Bautista, Orioles all-star closer, had Tommy John surgery back in October of 2023. The Orioles pretty much said it immediately. He was not going to pitch in 2024. He did have a follow-up procedure in February of 24 to kind of clean some things up in that elbow. Didn't push him back too much, but that kind of almost confirmed, hey, he's not going to pitch this season. But he started throwing during the summer. There were videos on his Instagram that he was posting. He threw his first bullpen off the mound at Oriole Park in August. He continued to throw those at the stadium, on the mound, and in the bullpen in September. And the Orioles have said he is going to be ready for spring training and for opening day. Now, I would not be surprised at all, and the O's have hinted at this a little bit already, if they don't ease him in a bit. Now, I'm not saying Felix Bautista's first outing is going to be in the 5th inning with the Orioles down 7-0 in April. I don't think it's going to be that much easing in. I just think that, he might not throw any back-to-backs in April. He might not get every single save opportunity in the first 2 months. They're going to ease him in a little bit so that he can feel right and know that by June, okay, we are full takeoff with Felix Bautista back to the old usage. But he did get used a lot, and maybe the Orioles back off a little bit. Maybe none of those things. Remember, he would come in the bottom of the 9th of a tie game on the road, pitch a scoreless inning. The Orioles would put together 1 run in the top of the 10th, and then Felix would come back out there and lock it down with a 2nd inning with the zombie runner out there, and the O's would win a 1-run game. Maybe less of those this year, maybe less back-to-backs early in the season. But the updates are all strong that he is going to be full go pretty much when we get to spring training and opening day of next year. Next question comes from Sean on YouTube, who asks, where do you see Trevor Rogers helping the Orioles in 2025? And did he make any changes after coming over to Baltimore and then getting sent to AAA? Now, the Orioles, in a much maligned trade, sent Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers to the Marlins for Trevor Rogers at the deadline last year. Rogers, who was fantastic as a rookie a few years ago, was kind of starting to struggle a bit, was having an okay season in Miami, but still was not back to what he used to be with the Marlins, with his velocity down. Came over to the O's, made 4 starts for the Orioles to try and help their rotation, was not good. He gave up 15 runs on 25 hits with 12 Ks and 10 walks in 19 innings. He was just bad, and he had options, and he wasn't pitching well, so the Orioles just sent him down to AAA to work on things, and that is where he remained for the rest of the season. He made 5 more starts in AAA, was also working on a lot of stuff in between those starts as well. The first one was really bad. He gave up 10 runs in his first AAA start, But in the next 4, he allowed only 8 runs total in 24 and a third innings with 28 strikeouts to 6 walks. He looked like a different pitcher down the stretch. Now, I understand he was facing AAA hitters and not major league hitters, and that is a gigantic difference. I get that. But it's not just the results that look different for Rogers down the stretch. It was also how he looked. It was his command. It was how his stuff played. He changed the shape of his slider. It started to have some different movement. It had a drop in velocity. He actually dropped velocity across the board on all of his pitches when he went to AAA. And it seemed like, and there was some talk about this, that was on purpose to actually help him get his command back and get his pitch shapes back, which it did work. He got them back late in the year in AAA. And he also brought his arm angle up. He was kind of dropping more and more sidearm as a lefty. He brought it back up a little bit in AAA, which actually helped with his shapes, especially on his slider, which was interesting to see. And I'll tell you, he made some changes. Now, will they turn into more success at the big league level? That we don't know yet. We're going to have to wait and see when he gets that chance in 2025. But even right now, I would put Trevor Rogers as the Orioles' number 6 starter, and that is right now. I would say if the season started tomorrow, Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Dean Kramer, Albert Suarez, Cade Povich would be the Orioles' 5-man rotation. I would have probably Trevor Rogers at number 6 with, Chase McDermott and Brandon Young falling behind him right now. The Orioles, even if they don't get Corbin Burnes or Max Fried, are going to add at least 1 starting pitcher and probably 2 this offseason. So if they do add 2, Rogers is going to get bumped down to 8th in the pecking order. And that doesn't mean the O's aren't going to use him. The Orioles used 12 different starting pitchers, not counting openers, in 2024. So, you need starters. You need more than 6, 7, 8 starters to get through a season. And I can pretty much guarantee you Trevor Rogers is going to start some games for the Orioles next year. The question is, will they be, hey, we're injured, we need Trevor Rogers for 3, 4, 5 starts, and instead he's in AAA? Or will it be Trevor Rogers has fixed things, and at the very least, he is a solid number 4 or 5 major league starter, and he can make 20 starts for the Orioles next year? That is the question we do not know. Spring training will help us try and decide that. What the Orioles bring in pitching-wise in the offseason will help trying to decide that. But I will tell you, he made adjustments. It was much better in AAA, and now we'll see if he can translate it back to the big league level. But 3 more questions to get to on this episode. We'll talk a bit more about the Orioles rotation. We'll talk about the potential at-bats to go around between Samuel Basallo and someone that the Orioles may bring in free agency. And finally, we'll talk about potential mock off seasons and which one would be better. That's coming up next to finish off the pod. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. The app is super easy. Big NFL weekend coming up this weekend. You're going to want to be on FanDuel. And you can get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So we've got 3 more questions today to finish off the mailbag. The first comes from Thomas on YouTube, who asks, do you see the Orioles at all going with a 6-man rotation next season? Now, I'll tell you right now, if they go into the season with this starting 5, as I mentioned before, my projection right now would be Rodriguez, Eflin, Kramer, Suarez, and Povich. Your 6th man is Trevor Rogers. I don't know if you need to force 6 guys into the rotation right now. But as I mentioned, the Orioles should add 1, if not 2 more starting pitchers by either trade or free agent pickup this offseason to add to that rotation. And it's possible, right? Like if the Orioles they bring back Corbin Burnes and then they go and get, I don't know, name your pitcher, Walker Buehler or something to put in the middle of the rotation. Then you're going Burnes, Rodriguez, Eflin, Kramer, Buehler, and then maybe you don't want to do Suarez in there as number 6. Maybe there's someone you want to save some innings. Maybe you bring in a really injury-prone guy and you want to, ease him along a little bit. Someone like a Matthew Boyd or something like that. Or Walker Buehler really hasn't had a full season in a while, so maybe he's that injury-prone guy you want to ease along and do a six-man rotation. But really what I'll say is the only way I see the Orioles definitely going for a six-man rotation is if they sign any pitcher out of Japan. Those pitchers are used to more so the six-man rotation, and specifically if the Orioles would be able to get Roki Sasaki. Now, we haven't talked about Roki Sasaki a lot on this podcast. Seems like he's going to be posted closer to January, which will put him in the next international signing window. I think the reporting is like the Orioles have $3, $4, $5 million to play with in that window. We'll talk about it more once he officially gets posted. But if they do find a way to bring in Roki Sasaki, they will more than likely go to a six-man rotation to kind of ease him more into the schedule of Major League Baseball. That would really probably be the only way I see it. But again, each of the last few years, the Orioles at some point in the season have gone to a six-man rotation just to get some guys some more rest, whatever it may be. So they're certainly at some point during the 2025 season probably going to go to it for a bit. But unless they sign Sasaki, I don't see it being like a full season thing because it's hard, right? When you have a six starting pitcher, that means you have one less reliever. So you're going with a 7-man bullpen instead of an 8-man bullpen, and it can put more stress on those relievers as well. That's why most teams don't do it for an entire year. Next question comes from Paul on YouTube, who asks, do you think Samuel Basallo being so close to the big leagues is factoring into the Orioles' decision to potentially bring Anthony Santander back? Now, Basallo was named by Baseball America the Orioles' #1 prospect. They just put out their Orioles list earlier this week, and go and check that out. Our guy John Mioli plays a huge role in putting together that list as well. But I think Basallo is a small factor in the Santander decision because in a perfect world, right, you have Samuel Basallo as your DH a lot of the time, while Adley is catching whenever Basallo is fully ready to come up to the big leagues, because Basallo's bat could be that special, where he is certainly a guy who catches for you some, but when he's not catching, he's DHing because the bat is going to be that good. That is what I see the role being for Samuel Basallo. And the thing is, Anthony Santander, eventually, maybe not even next year, I certainly think if the O's brought Santander back, you could play him in right field most days next season. But down the line, Santander's probably going to have to move to more, maybe not a full-time DH, but a lot more DH and a lot less playing right field, just as his body starts to age. And we know he's already not the most graceful guy out there in the outfield. But the first thing is, I think the only way we would see Basallo in the big leagues in 2025 is as a September call-up as a DH only. Now, his defense is certainly getting better. All the reports out of AAA Norfolk is that he's made huge strides as a defensive catcher, but I still don't think his defense is big league ready right now to be a catcher, and even to be a quote-unquote backup catcher in the big leagues and start 50 games behind the plate. I'm not sure he's ready for that at this moment. I think the bat could be ready by the end of this year, but I'm not sure the defense would be. So I think the only way we would see him this year is like at the end of the season, September call-up, he comes up and DHs. Kind of similar to what we saw from Heston Kjerstad in 2023 when he got that first call-up. So for that timeline, you're really not carving out a role for Samuel Basallo until 2026. So at that point, you're already into the second year of a potential Anthony Santander deal. And again, there is no guarantee that even in 2026, the bat becomes so good so quickly that you're like, we need Basallo in there every single day, whether he is catching or DHing or playing first base or whatever it may be. There's no guarantee of that. We've seen plenty of Orioles top prospects come up and struggle at the plate for a good bit, their first stint in the major leagues, maybe getting sent back down before they come back up and figure it out. So at that point, and again, he'd only still be 22 years old in 2026. He'd still be a very, very young hitter in the big league. So at that point, you're looking at 2027 as like, okay, that's the year where Samuel Basallo is an everyday, huge, all-star level, maybe contributor bat in our lineup. Well, I would think the Orioles would be targeting something like a 3-year deal if they wanted to bring back Santander. If you get to 2027, that is the final year of a 3-year deal for Anthony Santander. And at that point, Santander is probably pushing more towards DH. I think you can figure it out for 1 year, a way to get Santander and Basallo and Rutschman into your lineup a good amount. So for those reasons, it's a factor, but I don't think it's a big one. I would not let the impending arrival of Basallo make you not want to bring back as productive a hitter as Anthony Santander is, especially if you can get him on something like a 3-year deal. These prospects are great, but you can't count on every single prospect to hit, and especially not right away, and especially not to the production levels that we've seen from Santander over the past handful of years. Final question of the mailbag comes from Cole. This one coming via email. Cole says, if you could have one of these 2 free agent hauls, not considering the cost, which one would you take? Now, I'm going to assume in this question that each of these hauls is the entire Orioles offseason. They signed these 3 players, and that is it on each side. Haul number 1 is Corbin Burnes, Matthew Boyd, and Randall Grichuk. Haul number 2 is Sean Manaea, Walker Buehler, and Teoscar Hernandez. Now, in haul number 1, you get your ace back in Corbin Burnes. You get your true number 1, and you get a good kind of 3, 4, or 5 starter in Matthew Boyd, who has had some injury issues, hasn't thrown even 100 innings in a while. But when he came back from his Tommy John, he was really good down the stretch and in the postseason for the Guardians this year. I did have him in my top 6 in my free agent left-handed starter wish list, Matthew Boyd. And then you get Randall Grichuk, who was incredible in a platoon with the Diamondbacks last year, just crushing lefties. We know how much he has crushed the Orioles, so why not sign him? I had Grichuk on my free agent wish list for right-handed hitting outfielders as well. So these are all guys I would like to see the Orioles sign. In group 2 is Sean Manaea. I had him number 4 on my free agent starting pitcher wish list for left-handers. He's now up to number 2 because number 1, Blake Snell, signing with the Dodgers, and number 3, Yusei Kikuchi, signing with the Angels, are already off the board. So now it's Max Fried 1 and Sean Manaea 2. Manaea made those arm angle changes last year in the middle of the season that turned him into an ace-type pitcher down the stretch for the Mets. He could be really, really good. Walker Buehler, spoiler alert, is going to be on my next week free agent right-handed starting pitcher wish list in the top 6. Came back from injury for the Dodgers, had a weird year, but was really good in the postseason for them. We know how good he was before the injury. It's kind of a high-risk, high-reward kind of pitcher. And then the thing that makes this group is you don't get the ace in Sean Manaea or Walker Buehler. You get some pitchers who will certainly both slot into one of the 5 spots in your rotation and will help you win games. You don't get the ace at the top, though, and you kind of don't have that ace because you're not signing anyone else. So you're looking at Rodriguez, Eflin, Manaea, Buehler, Kramer is probably your rotation. In the other one, you're looking at Burnes, Rodriguez, Eflin, Boyd, and Kramer, probably. I think I like rotation 1 more because you have that ace at the top. But in the second group, you get Teoscar Hernandez, right? You get the masher in the lineup to replace Anthony Santander because in neither of these groups do you get Santander back. So if you get the second group with Hernandez, you get an everyday outfielder who's mashing in the middle lineup. With the first group in Grichuk, you get a guy who's more of a platoon player at this point. But I think I would take group number 1 because you get the ace in Corbin Burnes at the top of your rotation. Just makes your rotation look really good. And you still get Boyd, who would be one of your top 5 starters. Now, there are issues that, Boyd could get injured and he'll probably miss some time. But if you're signing 2 pitchers, that pushes Albert Suarez and Cade Povich and Trevor Rogers all into your depth starters instead of being in your top 5. So you can call on one of those guys if Boyd does suffer an injury, which seems likely to happen at some point during the season. And then, even though you don't get Hernandez or Santander, you don't get the big bat in the outfield, you get Grichuk. And I think with the amount that Grichuk crushed lefties last year and had a really great season and can still play the outfield, I think you could platoon him and Heston Kjerstad in right field. You could have Kowser in left, Mullins in center, and a Grichuk Kjerstad platoon in right field. And then that still opens up the first base DH for O'Hearn and Mountcastle and maybe getting Kobe Mayo in the mix. And you find a way to play all of your young guys while still have a lefty matcher in Randall Grichuk in your lineup. And I think still having that production from Grichuk while getting the big ace in Corbin Burnes makes that first group of Burnes, Boyd, and Grichuk better than the second group of Manaea, Buehler, and Teoscar Hernandez. But let me know in the comments. That was a great question from Cole. Love questions like that. If you're sending future mailbag questions, love those mock off seasons. Which ones would you prefer? Let me know in the comments here on YouTube. Would you rather have, this is your only pickups of the off season, would you rather have Burnes, Boyd, and Grichuk, or would you rather have Manaea and Walker Buehler and Teoscar Hernandez? Great questions in the mailbag. Again, send them in further here in the YouTube comments or email me lockedonorioles@gmail.com for further mailbags this season. Again, I'm recording this Wednesday, but it came out Friday. So if any other big news broke between basically on Thanksgiving, I will get to it on Monday's episode. Either way, we'll have all your updates when I'll be back on the podcast on Monday. We'll continue looking through these Orioles offseason moves as the winter meetings get closer and closer. And hey, Blake Snell has signed. That means maybe some of the big names will start to come off the board as well, but we'll get to it on Monday. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.